The NDA government has a majority, the BJP by itself doesn't. This is different from what this country has been used to over the past 10 years. How does the fact that the BJP is 30 plus short of a majority impact governance? How does this impact reform? How does this impact what the government can and cannot do? How does this impact the India growth story? To talk about this, I'm delighted to be joined on this broadcast by Ridham Desai, Managing Director at Morgan Stanley India, and one of the sharp watchers of the Indian policy scene. With us is Praveen Chakravarti, Chairperson of the Professionals of the Congress and heads the Data Analytics Unit of the Congress Party. Kanchan Gupta has worked within this government for a very long time, has a very sharp understanding of what's going on in the minds of the powers that be. And with me in the studio, my colleague Siddharth Zarabi, Managing Editor at Business Today TV. I want to go across to Ridham Desai first. Ridham, the markets were expecting a big surge on the Sensex and the NSE if the BJP had come back to power with an absolute majority. It didn't happen. The markets took a hit. Since then, they've recovered and are at all-time highs. But if we leave immediate turbulence on the side and take a longer-term view on the markets, what's your sense? Because this government doesn't have a full majority, how do you think it could impact the government's reform agenda? Ridham Desai.
Hey, thanks, Rahul. Great to be on your show. So I don't think actually it affects the economic reforms. Most of the economic reforms that this government has been pursuing over the past few years is in the domain of what I call execution, not legislative change. It may affect the political agenda where there are some law changes that may have been in the pipeline, but it doesn't affect the economic consequences. So if you look at it, there are three key things here that the government, I think, will try to do in its third term. The first is continue to pursue macro stability. And for your viewers, that should be just translated into, let's bring inflation down. More importantly, let's bring the volatility of inflation lower. And mind you, the government has been very successful on this since 2014 with a plethora of things that they have been doing. So I expect that to continue. The second thing is continue to build infrastructure, both physical and social. It's not just roads and highways, it's also about building homes, getting water to homes, getting electricity connections going, and then of course adding on. And over here, I think this third term is going to be all about railways. So I'm not surprised with the continuity in the railway ministry. I think it's quite critical because the railway has reached a point where it could be an inflection. And the share of railways in India's logistics is set to go up, which will bring down the cost of logistics. And guess what? That makes India a better destination for manufacturing. And that brings me to the third set of reforms, which is to enhance India's manufacturing sector. And if you look at this, India has been woefully unsuccessful. Since independence, the share of manufacturing in this country as a percentage of GDP has only been going down. And the government has been trying to lift it, and I think it's going to be very successful, also helped by the fact that a lot of corporations are seeking another destination away from China. So these are the three things that the government will do. None of this requires the parliament to stand up and say A. It is all down to the cabinet and the prime minister and what execution they can deliver.
Now, one of the things that we picked up from our data intelligence unit when we were tracking the results of the election is that there's rural distress visible in the voting percentages and seats that the BJP won in rural India, down substantially from the last time. And Rahul Gandhi and the Congress made all kinds of promises, 8,500 rupees, taka-tak directly into your bank accounts, apprenticeship schemes, and all manner of fiscally imprudent promises. This puts the government under pressure to try and do more for those at the bottom of the pyramid. This whole idea of uneven economic recovery, K-shaped growth, income inequality became a big talking point during the elections. This does put the government under more pressure to do more and to open their purse strings. How could that impact the fiscal path that the government had, where they were being very, very conservative, not spending recklessly, and even urging states to do the same? Now, states want to do more, and the government may be under pressure to do more as well.
See, now, allow me to respond this with three things. Firstly, redistributing taxes does not lift people out of poverty. We've been doing that for many decades, and India's poverty rate did not change. What changes poverty is opportunity, not redistribution of cash. And that is, I think, a very big thinking process within this government, in my view. It's neither the BJP's politics, nor its philosophy, nor its policy to redistribute taxes. In fact, let me add here, if you actually let the fiscal deficit rise, what you do, through redistribution, what you do is actually create inflation pressure. Inflation hurts poor people more than anybody else. So really what I think is going to get delivered, and we already have a hint of this, because what was the first decision the cabinet made? Let's build more homes. If you can house the poor people, if you can get them electricity, if you can build the social infrastructure, get schools going, poor people will rise from their poverty. And actually, we've been quite successful in the last few years. A lot of people have exited poverty. Poverty is not resolved. We are still a very poor nation. There are still a lot of poor people. There's more work to be done. But redistribution is not the answer. That does not eradicate poverty. So there will be a response. It will be in the form of social infrastructure, a point that I made at the outset.
Siddharth Zarabi has a question for you. Siddharth.
Rhythm, you mentioned houses, and just for everyone to recall, the budget had spoken about 20 million. They actually did 30 million. So a 50% increase straight away. But I want you to tell our viewers, what do you think of the finance minister's remark in the interim budget where she said, and I quote, that the government will take up next generation reforms, build a consensus with the states and stakeholders for effective implementation. She perhaps was almost talking about coalition politics, but Rhythm, what could those next generation reforms be?
So there could be a slew of them, Siddharth. Let me give a few examples. The first one is, say, GST. So, then GST, which when it was implemented in 2017, had a bunch of compromises around it, because we were asking the states to give up their power to tax goods and services forever. I kid around with American investors about this. Try asking 50 states in the United States of America to give up their power to tax, and you will not get a consensus for 100 years. So there were compromises made. Now that GST has to, get further and further refined. So that's where you need the states to agree. Another area, land reform. Now, it wasn't for lack of effort on the part of the Prime Minister that we didn't get the land reform bill in 2015. He tried, but the consensus was missing. So that's another area. I can tell you a third area where I'm hopeful but not expecting it to happen is farm. Now, if you ask me, one of the biggest risks in India, and it dovetails with the question that Rahul asked about poverty, is the state of farmers. We have 200 million farmers, which is 40% of India's workforce, and they produce all of 15% of India's output. They are 1/5 as productive as the rest of the nation. Farm is a quintessential state subject. The Prime Minister tried and had a very, very good set of reforms. It could have been that industrial revolution moment in India's farm sector, but unfortunately, the consensus was missing. So these are the next generation reforms that require the states to cooperate with the government. And if that happens, then, all my estimates about India's growth will be out of the window. We will go much higher than what I'm thinking right now. Even my optimistic forecast will prove to be conservative.
So what is your optimistic forecast? And what's your conservative forecast at the moment? How soon will India likely be the world's third largest economy?
See, that we have already printed in 2022. That I think is a likely event in fiscal 28, either 27 or 28, because in part it depends on what Japan does. So it's not an absolute thing for India. So depending on where Japan ends up, we'll be in 27 or 28. So I think the Prime Minister made that promise in the Parliament, and he will be able to deliver on that. So we will get there. Really, that's not the debate here, Rahul. The question is, when can we get our per capita income to $5,000? We're currently at about $2.5. And at $5,000, this whole country will feel a whole lot richer. That very section of the society that you referred to, where there is distress, will be out of distress. And I think that is something that could happen towards the end of this 5-year term in an optimistic scenario. And in a base case scenario, maybe by 2031. So that is where I think, some risks need to be taken. You see, the government and the Prime Minister especially, as I have termed him even on your show last year, I think it was, when I called him an inflation hawk. To be an inflation hawk means you have to be conservative with growth. Because if you let growth run away and the country is not ready for it, then you trigger inflation problems. And then poverty actually increases, does not decrease. So to deliver that mix, which in economic parlance we call Goldilocks, which is high growth and low inflation, is what this government will have to do. And to do that, I think they have to undertake a lot of supply side reforms. For example, you've got to build the judiciary. You have to build the bureaucracy. You have to build more education, more healthcare. These are the supply side things that are holding India back. And I think that could form a very critical part of the government's so-called reform agenda for the next 5 years.
Very fascinating insights, these from Rhythm Desai. I'd like you to stay with us for a while. As I said, this is not a debate that you typically see on television, so it's not a tu-tu meme. We've got different people who come from different points of view.